I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello and welcome to the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast. I'm your host, Antonio, and bringing to the show for the very first time, host of the CINEMIGOS, I got Rob here, one of the three CINEMIGOS, joining me to talk about a new series that I call The Hit List, where we discuss lists that have been compiled by IMDb, Letterboxd, Collider, all those different list aggregators. We're going to start going through these lists over episodes and talk about whether or not we think their choices are valid and what they're missing. But before we get into that, let's introduce our guest. I got Rob. Rob, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for the invite. Love to be on Cultworthy Studios. Been a show I've been enjoying myself. Yeah, really just happy to be on talking about 90s horror. Not the best decade of horror, but it's it'll be fun anyways.
It's a unique decade for horror because, I think each decade has its moments. 70s were like the seminal moments of horror when it comes to slashers, and we start coming up with like all the special effects wizards like Tom Savini. We get into the 80s, we perfect it, we get more Wes Craven action, we get horror franchises. And in the 90s, we just start taking these interesting leaps, right? We take leaps with slashers, we take leaps with supernatural stuff, and we get like the real kind of kinetic, frenetic energy from filmmakers like Peter Jackson and Sam Raimi kind of coming into his newfound fame and budgets with things like Darkman and Army of Darkness. So 90s horror, fantastic. But before we get into that, let's hear about the CINEMIGOS, what you guys do, how you got together, and this big milestone that you're celebrating very soon.
Yeah, we're coming up on a year of CINEMIGOS, which has been great. My co-hosts Heidelberg and John. Heidelberg and I are behind the scenes are really good friends. I met him through my other podcast that I do, and with his horror podcast, A Cut Above Horror Review. And after that, we just got started talking, and we would talk movies all the time, and we would introduce each other to new things. And it's like, we should make this into something. And so we came up with the idea of CINEMIGOS to kind of expand our cinematic horizons. Because I come from a background of film, I watch everything. I'm into the old classics that my grandfather introduced me to, the cult cinema that my dad introduced me to, that we would watch Mystery Science Theater 3000 together, and all the old 70s car films and motorcycle movies that he's into, that I got into. And my mom loved horror, so I would watch all the old Universal monster movies, and I would introduce him to stuff that he hasn't seen, and he would introduce me to weird 80s, 90s, 2000s movies that I haven't seen. And so we kind of developed this idea. It's like, well, why don't we make this into something? And we brought John along, that who was on a podcast of another friend of ours, and that's how CINEMIGOS kind of got started. And it's developed over time, and we've kind of developed a nice rapport. And I think I'm really liking what we're putting out. Like, I'm kind of the researcher of the of the group. I do all the research, and which takes a lot of hours. Heidelberg does a lot of the editing and kind of wrangling us in, and John is he's not uh, um a cinephile, if you will, but he's a guy, he's kind of the more normal moviegoer who's just kind of being introduced to all this stuff for the first time. And he's brought a lot of the movies that make us cry and think about things. So it's been a lot of fun doing this stuff with these two gentlemen.
I like that. And it's kind of how I choose my guests, because I try to put a wide variety of podcasters, not just critics, but also not just horror guys. Like, try to mix it up, keep it interesting, because I'm just a one-man show over here, right? Like, I'm doing the research and I'm editing and I'm doing two shows, sometimes three. But that's one of the things that I love about speaking with other cinematic podcasters, especially duos and trios like you guys, because they all have like their specific niches. You've got the mouth, you got the guy that makes the jokes, you got the research one, and it's a well-rounded thing because, sometimes you don't want to hear the three smartest guys in the room talk over each other. You want to hear someone that's got a rapport and like, oh, I didn't know that. Well, I didn't know that either. It's great. And you guys, especially the research, listening to your Dead Presidents episode and your Pool Hall Junkies episode, that's one of the things I really like about your show is that you're taking the time to talk about the movie, but also diving into all the things behind it, where the money came from, how they found their actors, who dropped out, who got found and made a star. Like, I love that kind of stuff because I really don't do that. I'm more of an exposure show. I'm going to talk about movies that people maybe haven't heard of or they loved back in the 50s and then they got forgotten about because of a political thing. Who knows? There's so many films. There's so many genres. And I think that now that we have podcasts and streaming and social media, there's never been a better time to get those old movies back out into the limelight, especially the way theaters are right now and they keep putting the same stuff out there, right? Let's go back and rediscover that good stuff.
Well, and that's what for me, like my movie taste, I love stuff from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We've done stuff like M, and we've done Rope, we've done High Noon, which are films that are popular back in the day or maybe have been popular for a time, but there's a lot of new moviegoers who don't know anything about these films, and I've been having a great time just being able to introduce that not just to the guys, but hopefully our listeners who what the hell is Rope? And now it's
Right.
a Hitchcock film that they've never seen before.
Right. Kind of introduce the world to like what real time filmmaking is.
Yeah,
And yeah, like people don't know about that as much because it's not up on the pantheon of Alfred Hitchcock movies. But it's one of my favorites. And it's one of Jimmy Stewart's most interesting performances because he's not the main guy. He's not the guy we're following or chasing after the whole time. He's the
right.
guy who's figuring it all out. Yeah, great pick. Yeah, so I can't compliment your show enough. And now that you're here and we're doing this, let's kind of get into it. So this is the problem, right? It's a blessing and a curse about being a cinema podcaster and a movie appreciator is that you have to sometimes let go of your sense of subjectivity when you're looking at some of these films because one man's trash is another man's treasure. And there's all these people's lists. And here's the thing. I got a bunch of lists on Letterboxd, right? I'm proud of my list, but I am hyper aware that there are plenty of people that look at my lists and are like, what the hell is that movie doing in his top 10 list? That's the blessing and the curse of being in this particular niche is that everyone's so goddamn opinionated, which is fine because that makes for good conversation. But it does make me wonder when these media outlets like Collider or I'm not going to say Letterboxd, but Ranker and The Chive, and they pull these lists together of best horror movies. According to whom? That's the big question. So we're grabbing Collider's this week. We're going to look at their 10 best horror movies of the 90s and see what we think about those. And then we're going to pick our favorites and dive deeper into those. How does that sound?
Sounds like a plan to me. Let's do it.
All right, so let's do it. So the first, I'm going to say on the bottom of their list, starting at the top 10 for Collider, is 1996's Scream. IMDb gives it a 7.4 out of 10, which is a relatively high score for a slasher movie from the 90s. Since this one was the one that you picked as your favorite, we're going to leave the discussion for the end because I don't want to run out of time. But how do you feel about it being at the lower tier of this?
That's a travesty. I'm sorry. The bottom of that list, I understand. Like, there's a few other films that I understand would be above it, but being at the bottom of the list, nah, I'm not with that.
Especially since it like reinvigorated the slasher genre, but we'll get into that when we go deeper into that conversation. Next on the list with a 7.4 out of 10, 1992's Army of Darkness. Now, I was actually surprised to see this on this list because if you talk to Sam Raimi fans and horror fans, of the three films of this trilogy, this one is the least horror of the three. This is actually more fantasy than horror. Yes, it's got deadites, but it really takes a step away from the horror element and really goes back into like the Ray Harryhausen sword and sandal fantasy realm. Yeah, it's still going to be shelved in the horror section, but I was really surprised to see that in the top 10. That doesn't mean I don't love it. I love this movie, but I'm really surprised to see it in the top 10. What are your thoughts?
I have a confession to make. I have never seen an Evil Dead film ever. Like I haven't seen any of
Yeah.
them. It's just one of those gaps in my film viewing, not because I don't want to watch the Evil Dead films. I just haven't gotten around to them for some reason. Out of all the horror films, and I love Sam Raimi, I love Bruce Campbell, but I just haven't gotten to the Evil Dead films for some reason.
And that's actually really not too surprising with some of the younger generations because there is kind of like this, I don't know, stopgap in Raimi's career when he stopped making horror and stopped making more serious pictures and then superhero films, right? Like
Right.
he is known for his horror and then he's taken a leap into more studio filmmaking, which I don't think it's a problem because even in his studio films, he does bring a lot of his old horror tricks to the table, which I think what's make those films new unique. Maybe they're not the best movies, but when I see a Sam Raimi moment in a Spider-Man movie or a Doctor Strange movie or even that Wizard of Oz movie that he made, I can't help but giggle a little bit because I know where it came from. It came from his horror roots. Well, since you haven't seen these three, that's your homework. But
Mhm.
of these three, it is the least horror of that trilogy.
I've
So it
heard
really
that,
kind of
yeah.
did surprise me. All right. So next on the list, 1992's Bram Stoker's Dracula with a 7.4 out of 10. This, I think, should be higher, but I'm happy that it's in the top 10 list. I don't know anyone that doesn't like this movie. I mean, there's some people that love it, there's some people that don't. I think at the end of the day, the two things that really stand out for me with this one is that it's Francis Ford Coppola making an incredibly artistic, beautiful horror film that's got a lot of great practical filmmaking before the days of CGI. And it really let us know how powerful of an actor Gary Oldman is. You know, he hadn't done The Professional yet. We hadn't seen him in the Luc Besson movies. So this was kind of America's introduction to this guy of like, who the hell is he? Is he even human? Now, to kind of follow that up, we do have to deal with probably the worst performance of Keanu Reeves' career, but it gets a pass for me because the movie is so good.
It's funny, you took it right off my notes because I love vampire films, especially ones that are based off of the Bram Stoker novel. It's probably the last great Francis Ford Coppola film. I mean, I really after Apocalypse Now, it was real touch and go. Apocalypse Now really broke him. I don't know. Even with like Megalopolis coming out soon, which I'm probably gonna watch just because I do love Francis Ford Coppola. I'm not sure how it's gonna be, but this is a great film, and despite the hilariously bad, distracting Keanu Reeves accent that he pulls off in here, but everything else about it is great. Yeah, Gary Oldman is amazing in it, and it's just looks awesome.
Yeah, I agree with you that it might just be the last great Francis Ford Coppola movie. It's an interesting thing where he's such an artist, right? Like cares so much about filmmaking, about cinema, that even when he tried to tell a conventional story, like I mean, even like The Rainmaker or Robin Williams and Jack, you know, Francis Ford Coppola directed a Robin Williams comedy. Yeah, he did. There's still all those Coppola elements, you know.
Yeah.
It's sometimes where I feel like the cinematic artistry takes a front seat to conventional storytelling and just getting the point of your movie across. Some might call it masturbatory, right? Where you're showing the audience more on screen and less than what's on the page. And so it will have its fans of people that love that kind of stuff visually. But some people, most people, just want to watch a movie that they can understand and start it and finish it and go home and feel great about it. They don't want to have to figure out why the camera's upside down when it's a comedy, like things like that. I am an apologist for Francis Ford Coppola, so I'm just saying what I've heard from other people. But yeah, when it comes to accessibility of Francis Ford Coppola films, this might be the last the last one of the 90s.
Well, and as far as like, I'm just thinking of conversation wise, what films people talk of his. Obviously, the Godfather trilogy. Obviously, Apocalypse Now. I think the conversation would be in that as well. And then there's this one.
Right.
The other films, I've seen his other films, and I do enjoy them, but there's not a lot of people talking about some of his more sub-tier films that I think still have some good moments. And
Mm-hmm.
but I'm glad that Dracula is on the list because I think this is just a great movie.
What's funny to me is how we laugh at Keanu Reeves' performance being,
And I love
I'm not going to
Keanu.
say it's amateurish, but it's just bad. His accent is bad. I'm really surprised that they chose him. The irony of it is that Winona Ryder was supposed to have been Mary Corleone in Godfather 3, dropped out, and then his daughter Sophia played Maria, and that was a travesty. It's what ruined the movie, according to most people, and in a way kind of ruined his career. So how funny is it that in this movie we have Winona Ryder, and she's amazing, but then we get a Keanu Reeves that's not. It's such an interesting turn of events where we kind of traded one bad performance for another bad performance, film after film, and for some weird reason, Winona Ryder is kind of like the connection to it. It's an interesting thing, in my opinion.
That's very odd. Yeah, yeah, it's right.
All right, so moving up to the next list with a 7.4 out of 10 is 1990's Jacob's Ladder. This is the movie that I think really kind of introduced the paranoia horror to the 90s, and then we saw a lot of it in the 2000s. There's a lot of camera work that I'd say is kind of proto when it comes to the inner workings of the psyche, seeing demons, a lot of strobe lights, the shaky face demons in the back seat. We'd see people like Aronofsky really take this kind of style of filmmaking and make an entire career out of it. And for those people who haven't seen this movie, think about the films like that do that. Requiem for a Dream and Pi, and then go back and watch this, and you can see the roadmap to that kind of style. Even Fincher takes a lot of influences from the camera work, and I'm going to say the lighting and set design from this movie. Absolutely banger. Totally belongs on this list.
Yeah, and, it's actually I haven't seen this in a very long time, probably since the 90s, but I do know of its influence, like, as you said, for, Aronofsky. I didn't even think I didn't have that in my notes, but I was like, "Yeah, of course it's Aronofsky was watching this movie." But I was thinking, like, Silent Hill, I know, a lot of people talk about it being an influence for it in the gaming, community, as I'm a gamer, so, yes, I totally see this film being a, inspiration for that. But even, M. Night probably took some of this stuff too, like with Sixth Sense, as well.
He definitely did.
But it's a great film, and, I think it also well, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but the star of Jacob's Ladder, I mean, it kinda introduced us a lot of, mainstream moviegoers to, a great actor.
Yeah, because up until this point, Tim Robbins did mostly comedies.
Right.
He was doing like Howard the Duck,
Oh
and
god.
what's the
That's
one I
right.
always laugh at? That the one I always laugh at, Bull Durham, where he is like the goofy pitcher, right?
Yeah,
In the
yeah,
Minor
that's
League
right.
Baseball team. That's what people kind of knew him from, and then here he is in this movie where we follow him during like a psychological breakdown that borderlines on the supernatural, and it really kind of did. I'm going to say what people call it, the Jacob Ladder scenario. No spoilers for people who haven't seen this movie, but when we talk about M. Night Shyamalan, or we talk about movies where there's a twist at the end that we probably didn't expect, but it does kind of answer everything. We can even call it a dream scenario if you want. The Jacob Ladder scenario has kind of become its own lexicon of, oh, it's a movie that the entire movie leads up to something that you weren't expecting. And some people love that twist, and some people think it's cliche now. But since this did it so long ago, it kind of set the stage and can avoid that kind of conflict.
And I also think too, what now there's some films that once you learn that twist, the movie gets worse with subsequent viewings. But what
Right.
makes some of these films great is when you do know the twist and you've watched it several times and it's still holds up and is still a good story that you can watch even if you know the twist.
I like that because I've always said that one of my grading marks for cinema for me is its rewatchability. I can watch a film and love it and never want to see it again, and that's fine. But when it comes to owning, I mean, you see all the physical media bullshit behind me, I won't buy something unless I plan on watching it again and again. I have no budget or shelf space for a one time view. Now, what I like about Jacob's Ladder, and what I will give M. Night credit for with Sixth Sense, is there's no laziness to the writing or the filmmaking because the hints are all throughout the movie, but you don't notice them right away because you don't know what the ending is. You don't know what you're looking for. And so that is when repeat viewings are a lot of fun. We're like, okay, Sixth Sense. We go back and we look at the red handle on the door and what does the color red represent throughout the movie? And what did they leave us, like breadcrumb wise, to get to the twist? Jacob's Ladder does the same thing. It does it with photographs. It does it with dreams. It does it with inconsistencies in this guy's personal history timeline that you won't notice on first watch. But when you go back and you repeat the watch, when you know how it ends, you can pick up all of the different things that the breadcrumbs that the filmmaker was leaving for us. And I would say it's one of the most rewatchable horror movies of all time for that reason.
It's great. I definitely need to revisit it. I watched it a bunch of times in the 90s. My grandfather had a VHS tape of it, and I watched the crap out of it, but I haven't seen it probably since the 90s.
I love the fact that you brought that up because when you go to your Silent Hill reference, like you said earlier, there is something about some horror movies that just work better lo-fi. Like I was raised on this movie on like a dubbed VHS off of HBO or something. So it was already grainy. It already had like little glitches and wavelengths through the screen. And for me, that added to the atmosphere of the film. When I finally like watched it on HD and Blu-ray, I'm like, I don't know why this movie isn't scaring me as much. And I think it's because I can see everything so much clearer. There is something about like a little bit of grain and a little bit of fuzz and green tints because you're like on a third generation copy of something that really adds to the atmosphere. And I think that's one of those movies. Like if I was to screen this for like a party or a horror marathon, I would probably make a few dubs of it and then show that because I think it adds to the aesthetic of the movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the VHS era for some of these movies kind of elevates them just a little bit.
Oh, especially for slashers, man. Like Friday the
Oh,
13th was
yeah.
made for VHS, in my opinion, but
Oh, yes, sir.
that's a different episode. I digress. All right. So, next on the list, with a 7.5 out of 10, 1994's Interview with the Vampire. It's a great movie. I'd say that it's more of like a character piece than a true horror movie, but that's kind of what made the novel and the movie so popular is in the 90s, I think it was kind of considered geekish or nerdish to freak out over vampires and horror stuff, right? Like mainstream audiences weren't really into vampire novels or vampire movies. I'm going to make the same reference with Twilight. Like Twilight created a whole new generation of people that looked into vampires. They're shitty vampires, but that's besides the point. You got to give Anne Rice credit for getting people back into gothic horror and for Neil Jordan to make this movie because it kind of put Brad Pitt on the map and it created it created a genre that we hadn't really seen except for in European movies, and that was a kind of fluid, romantic yet horrific vampire story. It's borderline a love story, but it's also not, and that's what kind of makes it great.
Yeah, it's funny. I like said it's like you're reading off my notes, Antonio. Like it's the proto Twilight, but in the same sense, it is kind of like this female-driven hammer horror, like neo hammer horror film that's done for America. That's
Right.
what Anne Rice kind of put out there, and it looks like that. It's it has a little bit of like the shine and sparkle, but also has that gothic hammer aesthetic that I think it's a certain niche that I think some people will like, and other people are like, What is this?"
But I mean, it made a ton of money, and they tried unsuccessfully to like reboot it, make sequels, make series, but they'll never capture that magic. I don't think so. Where you had Tom
No.
Cruise, Brad Pitt bringing Kirsten Dunst into the world for us in one of the best child monsters ever seen on film. But then also Antonio Banderas and Stephen Ray, like, and Tandy Newton. There's a lot of great people in this movie. Atmospherically, it's great. New Orleans, in this late 1800s, early 1900s, like Victorian era. It's just really, really, really unique. And also, I think the lore behind it's really fascinating too, with the fact that this would have been River Phoenix's last movie. He was supposed to be the interviewer. He passed away during production. There was actually scenes shot with him. And Christian Slater, being one of his best friends, just stepped right in and took over the role of the interviewer. So just think about that, man, where you would have had Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and River Phoenix at the height of his fame, just as
Of
his
his,
career was
yeah,
about to
yeah,
take off, and we didn't get it.
man.
So it's kind of a tragedy, but at the same time, it adds to the lore of this movie.
Yeah, that would have made it maybe an even different film. I mean, Christian Slater did a great job, but man, River Phoenix would have just made it even better.
I think it would have made it better. I think that we would have seen a whole new energy, and I think we would have seen a division of power and attention when it came to that trio of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and River Phoenix. So, yeah, great movie. I got to check it out again because it's been a few years. All right, so we're going to move up to the next one, but we're not going to talk about it because it's my pick for the top 10 films of the 90s horror wise. And that's 1992's Dead Alive, directed by Peter Jackson. I'm going to save that conversation till the end. Moving up
Sounds
to
good.
1997 with a 7.5 out of 10, we've got Michael Haneke's Funny Games. Now, have you seen the original one?
No, actually, I have not seen either the original or the remake. My co-host Heidelberg has covered the original on his horror podcast, The Cut Above. But I do know about like kind of the idea of these two people who come in and they seem very polite and nice, and then they torture the hell out of out of this family. Give it up to the Scandinavians. See this, some wild ass horror.
Right, for sure. And it's one of those interesting things where the director of the original remade his own movie for American audiences. And that one had Michael Pitt and Tim Roth and Naomi Campbell. And this is the weird thing is that it essentially is a carbon copy of the original, but it's nowhere near as biting as the original. And I don't understand why that is. I feel like he does go beat for beat and pace for pace, and the actors he chose are good, but there is just something about how it's made in its original language, where it's made, the culture there, the language really does a lot. And I feel like it's a lot more of an ominous film than the newer version. I think the newer version feels uglier and the older version feels more ominous. That's the best way I can describe it. The other thing too that it made me think of is there was a movie called The Vanishing, and it was I believe it was a German movie from the 90s, and it was remade by the same director in the US with Kiefer Sutherland, Jeff Bridges, and Sandra Bullock. And same difference. The original is known to be one of the scariest movies of all time, and then the remake, which the same filmmaker made, is considered like one of the most laughable horror movies of the 90s. I just don't understand it, and I feel like I don't have to. But when it comes down to it, it's a pretty damn good and scary movie.
Yeah, I've heard great things. It's definitely on my list. I'm probably gonna watch it here at some point. And it's funny you mentioned the idea that the same director is bringing back, remaking their own film. The one person I can really think that did a great job of that is Hitchcock with The Man Who Knew Too Much
Mhm.
from the 30s and the 50s version. And the 30s version with Peter Lorre is good, but I think he outdid himself with the Jimmy Stewart version, in the 50s. I mean, that's even better than the original. But it's kinda rare that you can take your own story that you've done, and maybe because it's already English language and it's just kind of translating some maybe more cultural stuff as opposed to translating it from a different language over to something to an American audience, where that's maybe where Hitchcock succeeded.
And there's things that happen in the movie too. I'm not going to spoil it, but it was one of the first movies that I saw that really took the audience by surprise by essentially breaking the fourth wall, almost Ferris Bueller style, where the laws of cinema and the laws of storytelling don't exist, where the people who are torturing this family and holding him hostage not only have control of the family and of the house and of the situation, they have the control of the movie where they can like alter timelines in the movie. They can stop it, they can fast forward it and rewind it, making it a whole different kind of experience. And this is where I think the disconnect happens is in the original. I don't think anyone had really seen that or done that before. And it really worked with the originality of it. So when they did the American remake, I think they kind of ruined the sense of surprise because people who already knew it was coming might have already talked about it. And then it kind of pissed audiences off because it's very unconventional filmmaking. And I think that might be one of the other reasons too. But also, those very polite, almost preppy young boys in the original version, when you translate that to America, it kind of represents like one of the things that most of us hate. And that's like the real kind of preppy douchebag attitude. We don't really trust those kind of guys to begin with. We know them, right? We've seen enough 80s movies to not trust the guy who wears his sweater around his neck at the tennis court. And I think that culturally we understand what that means and we just weren't buying it.
Yeah, exactly.
Jumping on to the next one on the list with a 7.8 out of 10, 1990's Misery, directed by Rob Reiner, based on the novel by Stephen King, starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. Man, I don't know. This could be one of the number ones in my spot too, but it's not my list. It is IMDb's list. To me, one of the better, if not best, Stephen King adaptations of not just the 90s, but just in general.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny because Rob Reiner also kind of came out of the gate swinging with like a bunch of films that he came out with, like from his debut up to this. I mean, he did Stand by Me. He did
Princess
The
Bride.
Princess Bride. He did this film. Yeah, it's so he was doing all these different genres, and he dipped his toe into horror with this one. And you get James Caan, who is already a star and amazing, and Kathy Bates, who had been kind of stumbling around until she got to this role, and she just broke out and became a huge star after this. And I think she won. I know she was nominated, but did she win? I think she won the Oscar for her supporting role in this. So
She did.
yeah, it was amazing.
And this is one of the things that I've never really been able to figure out is how there is such like a stark contrast between the quality of Stephen King adaptations. They're either really, really good or they're really, really bad. It's really hard to name like middle of the road, it's passable Stephen King adaptations. There's a couple, but generally they exist on those polarizing ends of like they're excellent, they're Shawshank, they're Green Mile, they're Misery, or they're Night Shift, right? All those other like anthology movies. I think Pet Cemetery is closer to the middle, but if you look at the critic scores, it's closer to the bottom. It's more of a guilty pleasure for certain people, right?
Yeah, oh
But
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, that's one of the things. And I've read a good chunk of Stephen King novels. They're kind of the same way. They're either really, really good or they're like, well, that was 1,000 pages I won't get back, you know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, this is one that is awesome, and just I mean the scene, the hobbling scene of like where she just busts his ankles. Oh, I mean that sticks in my brain even to this day. It's 30 plus years later, and it still sticks in my head.
And I like that as a villain. I like not just the performance because the performance is amazing, but it's also in the book. It's in the writing where what just because they're friendly doesn't make them your friend, right? There's a lot of that false trust in a movie like this. Funny Games plays the same way too, where it's like, oh, these guys don't seem like a big deal until they are. This one, I think, is one of the most extreme examples because there's the stalker aspect, there's the biggest fan aspect, the obsession aspect. Those are all frightening on their own, but then like they double down on the character's history and past of like, oh, this is a true psychotic woman who used to kill babies when she was a nurse in hospitals. Like, as we get introduced to more of those idiosyncrasies of this character, that's what builds the tension. And the fact that we have a horror movie that literally has like three major characters and that's it. You don't see that pulled off that well that often. And this really is a perfect example of it.
Absolutely. It's great.
All right. So next on the list, 1999 with an 8.2 out of 10. We've got The Sixth Sense. It's not the directorial debut. Most people don't know that. Let's call it the horror debut of M. Night Shyamalan, starring Haley Joel Osment, Bruce Willis, and Toni Collette. Yeah, so this is one of my questions for you, man. Does this movie, does it have the reputation and the longevity that it has strictly because of the ending, or is there legitimately a good movie inside this package?
So, it's funny you bring that up because my wife, who is not a cinephile by any means, I mean, I'm always trying to introduce her to stuff. It's like, oh, that's too old. Like, I wasn't even born back then, or I was only like 6 years old when this movie came out. Who cares? It's a good movie. Just watch it. So we watched this, and I've seen The Sixth Sense. I watched it when it came out in theaters. I've watched it a bunch, but I hadn't seen it in many years. It's probably been 25 years since I had seen it,
Hmm.
and I introduced it to my wife. She loves it, and she liked the twist and all that. And as I'm watching it, knowing what I know about the film, I kind of broke it down as, oh, okay, I know the twist. And as I'm watching, it's like this is still a really good story.
Yeah.
Yes, I know that Bruce Willis is the ghost. He doesn't. He's dead, but you still get the great drama of these characters, and you care about them, and you wanna see how Haley Joel Osment, how he progresses. Does he get better as a character? The connection between him and his mom, played by Toni Collette, and just the tragedy of Bruce Willis's character as the child psychologist. And I think it's a great story, and it's obviously it was the breakout film of M. Night Shyamalan. I think when you think of M. Night, this is the film you think of, is The Sixth Sense.
It's a blessing and the curse, right? When you hit the ball so hard right out of the gate and you're just so well recognized and appreciated for your work as a writer and as a director. And you've got three amazing performances to help your movie get there, right? Bringing Haley Joel Osment to the scene in a big way, bringing Toni Collette to American audiences, and then Bruce Willis reminding people that he can act, that he's not just Die Hard, right? He's not just the New York cop with a lot of wisecracks, that he can bring a lot of depth and emotion to a role. The curse is when you hit it out of the gate that hard, then you're expected to have that same synergy for all your films. And it puts a lot of pressure on M. Night because I feel like he's always tried to top himself after Sixth Sense. And those efforts where he did try to top himself are often the ones that crumble. Yet it's the ones where he kind of just does something small that gets him kind of more reaction and more appreciation because he's not making the Sixth Sense again. I've always said that I think that M. Night's a better director than he is a writer. And I would love to see him direct someone else's material because I feel that when he's directing his own stuff, he's not letting himself draw outside the lines enough to make us feel like he's making something different. He's trying to capture that same energy that The Sixth Sense had almost 30 years later, and he still hasn't done it. So a lot of people give him a lot of hate. I gave him tons of hate after. I'm not going to say Signs, probably The Village. The Village is when I started like really kind of losing my M. Night appreciation. That doesn't mean he can't get it back. I just think that he should really try working with someone else's material.
That's actually a good thought, because it's the Citizen Kane curse. When you, like you said, you
Right.
hit it out of the park that hard, and you're always trying to chase that dragon that just you never get there. And that doesn't mean that the other films that he makes are horrible. It's not quite that.
Right.
And so because of that, everyone's like, "Oh, well, it's okay." Oh, well, that one's like a little bit less than that previous one, which is definitely not The Sixth Sense. And then you get to the disaster that was The Last Airbender, and like some of these other pictures. And I
Right.
mean, The Last Airbender is not completely his fault. There was a lot of problems with that film, but, I think he's starting to maybe climb back up a little bit, but it's still I think, yeah, having a writer with him and him just working on directing would be a great idea.
Yeah. And he's nowhere close to being done, so we still have time. We might still see that M. Night Shyamalan renaissance that we've been waiting for, because we're getting some, but we haven't gotten the one yet. We still might. All right, so we're going to finish off this list with the number one horror film of the 90s, according to IMDb, at an 8.6 out of 10, 1991's Silence of the Lambs. So, controversial take on my end. I still don't think that Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie. I think it's a psychological thriller or a drama. It's got horror elements, but I think it's more of an FBI procedural than it is a horror movie. And a lot of people give me shit for that. What are your thoughts?
Oh, man, it once again, stealing off my notes, Antonio, like, my question is this a horror film? And I'm not gatekeeping, like, this to be like, "Oh,
Right,
it's not a real horror film."
right.
I it To be honest, I would love it to be a horror film because horror gets so disrespected as a genre, and this was an Oscar darling that swept all its Oscar
It
nominations.
did.
It won, I think, like 5 or 6 Oscars. It was,
The top
amazing.
four. Yeah.
And yeah, and I love the film. My wife loves it. But yeah, because if you make this a horror film, then why is it Seven not a horror film? It's kind of the same idea.
Right. Why isn't Gone Girl a horror film? Why isn't Kiss the Girls a horror
Yeah.
film? Right.
So it's kind of like it has the elements, it has aspects of horror, but it's not a real horror film. And it's one of those things when you start diving into figuring out what genre a movie belongs to. It's like that moldable sand that you put in water and you can kind of mold it, but as
Yeah.
soon as you take it out of the water, it just falls to your hands. That's kind of what you with this film. That's kind of what it feels like, and you understand, like, I know what a horror film is, and this just doesn't meet the mold for some reason.
Okay, so yeah, simpatico here, man, because I've talked to so many people that have the exact opposite opinion of that. We're like, no, it's the best horror film ever made. And that's where like the whole idea of like how are we really putting things into these genre categories? Perfect example is, growing up I had two video stores next to me. I had Hollywood and Blockbuster Video, essentially across the street from each other. Hollywood had it in drama, Blockbuster had it in horror. So it's subjective. It's subjective to, I guess, whoever is the one putting it on a streaming device or an app or putting it on a video shelf. For me, I've got it in drama. I don't have it in horror. And I've had people come look at my collection. They're like, why is that in drama? I'm like, well, tell me why the fuck is it supposed to be in horror? Like, it's good fun. I love having that debate because to me, just because something has horror elements in it doesn't mean it's a horror movie. If that's the case, then why isn't Pee-wee's Big Adventure a horror film? Because Large Marge scares the shit out of me, right? It's that same argument, man.
Exactly. And like I said, I love Silence of the Lambs. I love the
Me too.
book. I love the movie. Anthony Hopkins is one of my guys. I love most of the movies that he's in. Even the ones that are not that great, like Bad Company, I know is not a great film, but I love him in it. I
Yeah.
think he's hilarious. But it's just not a horror film. And I was like, this is so I know a lot of people wanna kinda shoehorn this into, the great horror list, and I'm like, "Nah," and I talked to a bunch of my friends, and they're all divided. "Oh, yeah, it's definitely a horror film." "Nah, no, it's not a horror film." It's not I don't know. I didn't agree with it. I don't think it's horror. It's an investigative thriller, but it's awesome.
It's awesome. And the world may never have a final answer for that.
Exactly.
All right, so let's jump into our two picks of the best horror films of the 90s in our opinion. So I'll get mine out of the way pretty quickly because I think the easiest way to defend it, and that is Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, is this was a film that intentionally tried to out-gore Evil Dead 2. Peter Jackson saw Sam Raimi's movies of the 80s and he's like, hold my beer, and made one of the most bloody, gruesome, disgusting, violent, but also hilarious horror films of the 90s. And it's so funny that this is like Oscar-winning Lord of the Rings director that got his start in horror. He was New Zealand Sam Raimi. Bad Taste, Dead Alive, Meet the Feebles, which is scary to me, even though I wouldn't call it a horror. And then he goes on and makes prestige movies. I'm not saying you can't take that path. Obviously you can, but so many people don't know that his roots are in grotesque horror. And this to me is the most grotesque film of the 90s. It really just doubles down on the horror elements of zombies and mutants and devil babies that tear people's faces open. Beautiful. I loved it. And if anyone thought like the chainsaw action was great in the Evil Dead movies, well, this guy has a lawnmower that he takes out a room full of zombies with. Where is our video game for Dead Alive, man? I want to chase zombies around with a lawnmower and take some people out.
Yeah, dude. And so it's funny when you said that you wanted to highlight this film. I had never watched it before, so I watched it this week
Uh-huh.
just to prepare myself, just so I understood what the hell you were talking about. And it is one of the most batshit crazy, hilarious zombie films I have ever seen. It is awesome. Yeah, it's all the things you said about it. It's so fun, and I'm so glad I watched it. And it just because my introduction to Peter Jackson was the Lord of the Rings trilogy,
Mm-hmm.
King Kong, and the stuff he's been doing now. But knowing that like this is kind of his beginnings, it's fun, man. And
Absolutely.
is it true that Sam Raimi doesn't like this film because it's kind of it's paying tribute, but it's kind of ripping off of like Evil Dead a little bit?
So that was the gossip of like the late 90s. I think now that they're both multi-million dollar, have their own companies making prestige movies, I think they're kind of over it. But back when they were like scraping dollars together to make these kind of movies and trying to get them in front of audiences, I think that was probably a discussion that was being had around Hollywood and around the horror circles. I'm pretty sure that they're both over it by now. But one of the things I would like to see is we know that Sam Raimi is currently in development of a new horror movie because he wants to go back to his roots. I want to see Peter Jackson do the same. I want to see a down and dirty, blood on the wall, guts on the floor Peter Jackson movie after the last 20 years of what we've been seeing from him. It's time for him to go back to his roots, in my opinion.
And especially with the resurgence of horror within the last 10, 15 years, I think that'd be great.
Shit, man. This year, horror is ruling the box office.
Yeah, man, it is.
All right, so let's talk about yours, which was at the bottom of the list for the 1990s, man. But I'm not going to lie. If Silence of the Lambs wasn't number one on this particular list, if this was my list, I'd put Scream at number 2 right underneath Dead Alive because it is the most, I'm going to say, important, influential, and necessary film to get horror back to where it was from the 1990s, to get away from the silliness and to get back to the idea of what are we looking at? We're looking at teenagers following like the classic John Carpenter rules of horror, having multiple villains and having good old fashioned chase them and slash them scenes. It is the best.
It's an amazing film. It wasn't until about a year and a half ago. I had never seen any of the Scream films, and I just dove in. My wife and I, we watched all the Scream films. Watched Scream 6 in theaters when it came out, and
Mhm.
it just, man, blew me away. I thought it was awesome. Even though I'm coming to it 25 years later, and what learning about the film, the idea that, the slasher was dead. Yeah, Jason
Right.
Goes to Hell was a disaster. It's a terrible movie. I don't like it. Of all
It's
the Friday
terrible.
the 13th movies, it's my least favorite. I don't like it. Um, Freddy's New Nightmare, while I think it's a fun film, it was not received very well. Halloween is kind of fluttering around. It still is, but it's so a lot. It's just the slasher was dead. All the major ones were dead, and Wes Craven was getting out of horror. He didn't want to do any more horror films. He wanted to do more of these psychological thrillers, like Red Eye, stuff like that.
Hmm.
And actually, initially, when this script was being put out into Hollywood, they were getting, I think it was like Paramount was involved. They were going to have Oliver Stone direct the film, which would have been a wildly different film.
Right.
But yeah, they threw money at Wes Craven, Dimension Pictures, which was kind of the one of the early Miramax subsidiaries, and they got Wes Craven, and he's like, "You do whatever you want. You make this meta commentary on horror films." And man, it blew people away. And Drew Barrymore was going to be the star, but she backed out. It's like, no, 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 let me play this psycho-esque character where I'm going to get killed off in the first 20 minutes of the film, and then you have to deal with that the rest of the movie. And I think it's great, man. It was so Nev Campbell was great, Skeet Ulrich. Uh, it's
Matthew Lillard.
Rose McGowan,
Yeah.
Jamie Kennedy. I mean,
Yeah. It gave us a great, great bunch of 90s actors that I still get excited when I see them in things today, for sure.
Yeah, and it's just obviously it spawned many sequels. I mean, Scream 2 came out pretty much the next year.
It
They
did.
pretty much as soon as they were already working on the sequel as they were working on the first one. I mean, that's how much they believed in the project, and it was just one of those films. It was the little film that could, because it initially broke out first weekend, didn't do that well. Next weekend did the same amount of money, and it just kept going and going and going, and it made some like $120 million off of a nothing budget.
And let me tell you, man, like being old enough to have seen those first two movies in the theater and being a teenager and being with other teenagers in these full theaters, it's something that I feel like we really don't see a lot anymore. And that is the audience participation and like the trust that you're in a room with like 300 strangers, but you're all afraid of the same thing. You're all screaming at the same things. The energy is cohesive. You're all part of like the same neural net when you're watching a movie like this. I've been going to movies since I was a little kid. The only movie that was even close to this in the sense of the audience reactions that I'd seen in the theater at that point was Jurassic Park. People freaking out over Jurassic Park just because it was something that we hadn't seen before. And then Scream 1 and Scream 2, I tell you, when everyone gets up and screams and popcorn's flying, yeah, it seems kind of like cliche, stereotypical from the movies, but that's what it was. And we don't see a lot of that anymore. I'm going to say the closest thing for me was, although I hated the movie, it did scare a lot of people. When the first Paranormal Activity came out, I did have an audience experience that was very similar. But the problem is when you start building sequels and franchises and you're ready for the scares, well, then they're not as important anymore. They're not as terrifying. If it's expected, it waters it down. So there's something about like that first one or two films in a franchise that really can make an audience react at the same time. It's really hard to recapture that. And I think movies have gotten so far away from that. Now it's like the superhero moment that gets the cheer, or Deadpool and Wolverine doing something cool that gets a cheer. But horror, it doesn't get the cheer like it used to, man, and we need it.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think Scream excelled, because it's pointing a finger back at horror, and it's like even like with Scream 2, where it's like, yeah, sequels are inferior films, and they're commenting on that, and it's
Right.
the law
It
of
was
diminishing
meta before
returns.
meta was a thing.
Exactly, and that's what makes the sequels to Scream, I think, pretty great too, because it's doing that all of that. Now, Scream 6 got a little ridiculous, and I hope there's not a Scream 7, because I think it'll be a disaster. But that's a story for
Right.
another day.
Yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. So, I don't want to like make you sit and think, but if this was your list, like I said, this was an aggregated list from IMDb. Were there any 90s films that weren't mentioned that you think deserve a place in the top 10 of horror films?
Oh, absolutely. For this era, I tried to stay away from ones that are sequels that were in this time frame, but I had Arachnophobia, I
Mm,
had It, albeit it's a TV movie, Tremors, Candyman, The Craft, From Dusk Till Dawn, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Blade, which you could maybe argue is maybe not a horror film.
right. It's more of a horror film than Silence of the Lambs is.
Yeah, I'm shocked that the Blair Witch Project's not on the list.
Yeah, so I think that is the one that I would have added. The challenge with that one for me is Blair Witch's rewatchability isn't very high.
Zero.
It's practically zero, right? But that first experience, especially in the right setting, it is an unforgettable horror experience. But yeah, there's a reason why it kind of tanked when it came to home media sales because no one was scared of it on their VCR.
No, no.
Like it was one of those theater
Yeah.
movies. Like unless you're watching it camping out in the woods, there's not a lot of replay to it.
Yeah, the only time you'd want to like rewatch it is like if you're showing it to somebody for the first time and they've never
Yeah, who
seen
never
it,
seen
and
it?
that'd be
Like your
about it.
kids or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like it. I like it. No, great conversation, man. Thanks for coming on to the show and doing this list. And we'll do more lists because if there's one thing that I love about the internet, it's going down this rabbit hole of like, okay, I'm gonna see whose opinions have formed these lists that some people are taking as gospel. And I'm not pretentious. I'm not going to say that they're idiots for following it. I just like to see what other people think. It's why I think Letterboxd is one of the best apps ever made because you can create your own lists and you can look at anyone's and you can find new discoveries and you can have friendly discourse or debates. If you want to be a dick, you can go in there and start talking shit in the comments, but whatever. I don't think a lot of people are there to do that. That's what Twitter was for, right? So this is a great time for cinema discovery. I'm not saying it's a great time for movies in the theater because I'm still not convinced that we'll ever get back to the old days. But for discovery, what with all the streaming apps, what with YouTube and boutique DVD and Blu ray labels, and you can still find VHS at the library sometimes, being able to see movies on these lists that you might not have seen, for example, Dead Alive in your case, and being able to experience them for the first time and hear and see what other people are talking about, like that's why we do this. That's why we have podcasts.
Yeah, I mean that's why I do what I do. That's why Cinemigos is a thing because it's about introducing people to films they've never seen before. And keeping stuff alive. There's all sorts of gaps that we have, and it's been fun. Yeah, I've met you, I've met Phil, I've met Caesar from Rad Revival House, and you guys all
Yeah,
talk about films. A lot of them I've never heard of. It's like, oh, great! It's more stuff that I can add to the list and check out. And the conversation that you guys bring to the table are always a lot of fun. And hopefully, people think the same things about the Cinemigos. Hopefully, they're enjoying our conversations about the films.
absolutely, man. You're in the fold now. Like
All right.
the three people that you just mentioned, we're probably with some of the most vocal ones on the social apps about this stuff. So yeah, we're involved now, and we keep meeting more and bringing more people into the fold. And I'm of the opinion that there will never be too many movie podcasts because everyone's got their own take, and the more you can have a discourse and debate, it's less arguments without any like there's a relevance to it now. You can back up what you're talking about because there are now people who have seen these movies where I mean if you're as old as I am, maybe a little bit older or younger, back in the day, you kind of had to take people's word of the one guy that had the bootleg VHS that this movie was great, but no one else has seen it. So you just kind of had to take the movie guy's word for it. And now everyone can be the movie guy, and I like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, like I said, thanks for having me on, man. This is a lot of fun. I hope to be back again sometime soon.
So before we let you go, let's give you a chance to shout out your socials and plug anything you want to plug, where people can find you.
Yeah, well, our recent episode is Dead Presidents, episode 49. That just came out this past week. Check that out. You can reach us find our episodes on anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, all that good stuff. You can reach us on X at Cinemigos, TRESCINEMIGOS, Instagram, Cinemigos_podcast. Those are the places you can find. We have a letterbox too, Cinemigos. give a link to our episode and give a little synopsis of the film.
I'm not even sure if I'm following you on Letterboxd yet, so I will fix that tonight.
Okay, awesome, man. Thanks.
Everybody, go over to Cinemigos, follow them, like, rate, review, give them 5 stars. Please do the same for me. Continue listening, continue watching, continue rating and reviewing, and you can also find their link in the Cultworthy Partners page of my website, thecultworthy.com. Rob, thanks again, and I hope to see you soon.